I'll try to cover three specific areas. So first part of it will be about digital and mostly my thoughts on the state of play, as it were, in this huge area and the digital when it comes with the heritage management together. And the second part will be about our major project called CAL, or Central Asian Archaeological Landscapes. It's an ongoing large-scale project where I'm a co-PI, but it is very much a collaborative and a collective effort. And then at the end, the third part, maybe a slide or two, I'll talk about the careers, because again, we discussed this with Simran, and what digital can help you, especially if you are a recent graduate in this area. I'm afraid I will remain rather generic in all of these areas with a focus on philosophies and challenges. Although if you have interest in individual specific methods or techniques, then I'm very happy to discuss that later as well, because those are also interesting. So starting with digital, I think we have to acknowledge this continuous innovation in this area. There is a rapid introduction of all sorts of so-called new technologies into cultural heritage field. Although some of them are not that new, nevertheless, the title new stays with them for some reason. We are in heritage, in archaeology, we're very good at borrowing tools from other disciplines, from other sectors of economy sometimes, but also inventing new approaches ourselves. Tool sets that are invented for the basics of archaeology and heritage, such as, for example, field recording technologies, are a very interesting area. But although there is a lot of innovation, there are also issues with cross-compatibility and how those tools are shared in different parts of the world, but also within specific countries as well. And that there is an ongoing issue with levels of connectivity that we have. There is an ongoing issue with the levels of access in general, and I'll talk about those things a little bit later on. And the results and the outputs of these processes is more and more complex. So we deal with the three-dimensional data now universally in many areas within heritage recording to heritage management. And then also processes of creating those data sets are becoming more and more complex. So then the process is leading to this area where managing heritage is now also expected to be very digital. Although what that means is still very different in different localities. Sometimes digital heritage management in people's ideas is basically creating some data in a Word or Excel file, and sometimes it's more of a interlinked geospatial databases that are essentially doing the major heavy lifting of the heritage management in the first place. It's becoming more specialist dependent and also more specialist tools dependent as well. And this is true globally, universally, and everywhere we notice that trend now. But at the same time, heritage organizations are not always well equipped to work with external specialists because they depend on external specialists in order to have access to these specialist tools. And sometimes they lack internal capacity. And again, the situation differs in different parts of the world. In places like the UK, for example, where I am now, heritage organizations are very much underfunded. They don't necessarily have the resources to invest into this area. And same is true in regions like Central Asia, for example, where I work a lot. Some countries are not able to keep up with this growth, although some others may have some extra capacity to invest into this area as well. And therefore, there is this question of sustainability, and sustainability of data is a primary issue because digital data also requires some additional steps to make it sustainable and usable and interoperable in a longer term future. But there are also concerns over the long term of management of heritage in general. If we keep on doing this innovation in digital area, does it actually help with management longer term, or does it actually hinder some of the ongoing efforts? So, as I mentioned, there are challenges over longevity and the cross-compatibility, and it's specifically very obvious at this stage in time in terms of formats and the open data. We keep talking about the general formats that are non-proprietary. Nevertheless, we're still very far away from organizations universally grasping that concept and actually committing to formats that will be long-term and that will be sustainable and cross-compatible between different systems. And there are also issues in terms of the what types of IT systems in the first place different organizations invest to, and do they actually pay attention to the, again, sustainability and the openness and the interoperability, and then the longevity of those formats. There are major organizations who are independently doing work in this area, doing research and creating guidance documents, but as I said before, most of the heritage organizations do not have that ability, and learning from the bigger organizations also requires some specialist input and also requires some specialist time as well. And these challenges apply to both born digital and digitized later data sets. As I'm sure all of you are aware, born digital is becoming a major scheme or topic within heritage, where we record things from the outset in a completely digital formats and in a completely digital tool. So the data itself is born digital. But we also work with a lot of data, a lot of materials that are conventional materials that are digitized later using the guidance documents that I mentioned that are created by major institutions, sometimes are creating a new workflows for that. These challenges apply to both of those areas as well. And often I end up asking questions that, are we creating a digital divide within this global community of practitioners as well? Because digital divide became a very mainstream topic, especially during the pandemic, when we suddenly realized that working from home requires specific equipment, but also specific levels of access in order to make everyone able to learn in an equal measure, or able to contribute to ongoing work in an equal measure. But taking that digital divide concept further, if we multiply it to this global level of community of practitioners, are we creating simply a digital divide where certain regions are left behind in a very conventional tools, and certain regions are going ahead with a lot of innovation in digital area? And does it actually help us longer term to unify our efforts, for example, especially if the sites and the monuments or if the heritage assets are of a universal significance for all of us? And there are also broad implications. Are we facing the reality of high-end and low-end heritage documentation and management? So, for example, I have recently traveled to China, where I saw exceptional examples of innovation, where colleagues are doing amazing work in terms of documentation and a very specialized levels of documentation and very specialized levels of digital as well. But are we then facing the reality where certain destinations, certain geographic areas, countries or regions are ahead of the curve and are doing this in a very granular, very detailed level, and some other areas are left behind? And then also, whilst we're doing the capacity building more or less universally, especially led by institutions that are major research institutions, that are major international organizations in heritage, is it feasible to enhance skills universally across all levels? And at all levels here, I mean the heritage organizations of differing levels as well. As we know well, even within one country, we face the reality of heritage organizations being in a different, not only national, regional or district level, but also in the different levels of the knowledge and the different levels of the initial starting point in this area. And then in the face of this ongoing and the constant pressure to make things happen quicker, so for example, in terms of documentation, in terms of condition assessment and the heritage inventories, can we actually afford to slow down and incorporate research-driven and the management-oriented technological solutions? So instead of, for example, rushing through the tasks because we can just do it and collect ever-growing amount of data that we don't know what to do or what the future generations will use it for, actually, can we actually slow down and focus on specific questions and then innovate as a response to those questions? And those questions could be research questions if we are coming from academic background. They can be also very much a management-oriented questions where we are looking for technical solutions, technological solutions that help us to preserve heritage longer term, to disseminate knowledge about heritage, to popularize heritage, or to do all sorts of other things that whatever the management structures in the locality decide to be relevant to them. And then in terms of sustainability, if we take the sustainability of heritage management, is more technology always the answer? So just because we can do technological solutions, digital solutions, just because we can use digital tools, should we be racing again to use them for management? Is it always the answer? What's actually the the purpose we are doing it for. And then sustainability of technology. As all of you know, everything ages in a digital world a lot quicker, both in terms of hardware and also in terms of data itself too, and software as well. So how can we ensure that technological approaches and the methodologies evolve sustainably and remain manageable? So how do we make sure that organizations are able to invest into these technologies over and over again in near future, in mid-term future, if not at long-term future as well? And then sustainability of data itself, how we can ensure that digital data related to heritage is valued and preserved as preciously as heritage itself. And this is one of my major points in general when I do the training sessions or capacity building sessions, because organizations often imagine digital data to be more or less permanent. Once you create digital data, as if it will always be available to them, as if it will always stay somewhere and be accessible, which is very far from the truth. We know the issues with backups. We know the issues with ever-changing world of different internet pages. We know that the reality of the ever-changing world of the different servers. It's very different environment than 10 years ago now, and it's very likely to be a very different environment again in a 10 years time. And so as a global community of specialists here, I think we have to do global advocacy in this area. We shouldn't be working within one country or within one region. We should be exchanging ideas and doing more of a global level advocacy where we can ensure that, starting from the level of international organizations to national governments and going below that, everyone is interested in investing into this area, investing into the capacity building, investing into the creating, for example, repositories that can preserve heritage data, seeing heritage data as valuable as the heritage itself or heritage objects itself. And there are many examples we can go in here. We often work with the documents, for example, of the monuments, that the monuments themselves do not exist or don't exist in the same condition that they were documented at. Nevertheless, those documents can be preserved as a digital records for the future generations. And sometimes I face the reality where those digital records are then not really, they're neglected, they're not seen as valuable as the monuments itself. So we have to think about it as a multi-layered approach, as a multi-layered philosophical approach as well to this area. And can we ensure that there are global collaborations going on in this area in particular? So the collaborations are not only limited to, for example, English-speaking academia of the Western countries, but it actually goes well beyond that and involves different linguistic traditions, involves different geographic areas in order to make it a global collaboration where findings are shared and the advocacy is done in an equal measure as well. And so that brings me into second part of my presentation where I wanted to talk about the one project that I'm lucky enough to be in part leading, which is Central Asian Archaeological Landscapes Project. And this involves 5 Central Asian countries, starting with Kazakhstan, Kyrgyz Republic, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Turkmenistan. And then it also includes Xinjiang Autonomous Region in China as well. And then this huge geographical area. Our aim with this project is protecting archaeological archives and archaeological records, heritage records, through high quality digitization, and then enhancing those records through remote sensing, basically using extremely detailed analysis of the satellite imagery of different years, but also working with aerial photography and involving the more modern tools that are in our disposal as well, starting from UAVs or drones and ending with all sorts of terrestrial recording techniques as well. And then making these records usable and accessible by local heritage and the conservation specialists in order to help them to protect and manage archaeological resources better. And doing all of this together with them very much is a key part of the project, and I'll come back to that later on as well. And then developing specific case studies to highlight the threats and also challenges facing archaeological resources in this region. And the other critical part of this project is disseminating that data in open access and also disseminating it through georeference database of archaeological sites, and making it more or less accessible, although we are talking about the different levels of access as well because of the safety concerns or because of the security concerns. And capacity building in digital documentation is also another part of the project, both in terms of the archival digitization, but also in terms of field recording. and uses of digital geospatial data in managing resources. We also train or undertake the capacity building in those areas as well. And so we digitize or survey a cultural heritage in the scale that hadn't been done before, and that's not surprising. It's a huge region. It's a developing region. The post-Soviet part of it, in particular, needs a lot of assistance and support with digital. Although there are colleagues who are also very advanced in this area by now as well. And we work with very different ranges of documents. So the first picture you see here is the document which is the monument passport. Soviet period was famous in terms of formalizing heritage management. So there are monument passports for almost every archaeological site, for almost every standing structure, almost every memorial in these countries. And those passports serve as a basic documents that essentially act as a brief description of the monument and a brief information, but also some obligations are then placed on the owners of those monuments or the heritage management authorities to protect those monuments. If they were essentially passporting monuments means listing monuments or scheduling monuments. And we deal with the archive materials that are, for example, here the negative in a very fragile condition, but these photographs are taken in 20th century. Sometimes we deal with even late 19th century photographic records as well. And preserving them is only possible by digitizing them in a high quality, in a highest possible quality, using the equipment we have here, because they are by their nature prone to degrade over time, and that accessibility is going to be an issue in a longer term. And we have also lots of drawings, for example, lots of maps that are made out of hands. And then we also have this, you probably see the shelves of the archive materials. We have many of these type of places, archives of institutions, archives of the heritage management agencies of those countries, where we work together with the local colleagues in order to systematically digitize and then also to organize these materials in a manner that will continue their life cycle, both in terms of the tangible materials, archive materials, and also create a new life cycle for them as digital data sets as well. And we, of course, enhance that with using different technology, different surveying methods on the ground with local colleagues as well. And the result is usually this multi-layered databases, multi-layered GIS databases. So what you see here is the one region of Tajikistan. It's in a QGIS, the open source GIS package, where we have the layers of information with digitized Soviet period maps. The yellow boxes that you see that don't quite match because the coordinate system used there is very different from projections and the coordinate systems that we use now. And then also a black and white image or grayscale image that you see here is a corona imagery, American spy satellites, primarily from 60s and 70s. And we digitized those as well because they show the region before it underwent extensive change with expansive agriculture and the change of the waterways in the recent past as well. And then a lot of additional data that we generate using some computational approaches. For example, the waterways could be calculated reasonably easily nowadays, or the DEMs, digital elevation models of those landscapes, can be created using the readily available satellite data and using a little bit of a clever algorithm that we innovate and create ourselves as well. So this type of a data set then gives us a basics to share with the local colleagues as a heritage management tool. And then the data that we digitize from there or created using our modern tools, we try to make it as open as possible and as shareable as possible as well. So very much under the FAIR rules. And what we use for that is primarily the UCL resource data repository. Some data sets are already there, and a lot of them will be going there as well. It allows us to create unique digital object identifiers, DOIs, and it essentially ensures that as long as the major institutions like ours stands, these data sets will be looked after, and these data sets will be accessible to global community as well without any restrictions. These are all under Creative Commons licenses as well. And what we try to do is the dynamic and static data. So some data, for example, repository-based data, is very much a static data. It's not, it is basically TIFF files and the PDF files, which are more long-term options for us. But we also try to share some data using a more or less not that much stable platforms, things like Sketchfab, for example. We're working on a more open source 3D data sharing platforms now as well, making sure that people can also access the dynamic data sets as well, so they can play with it in the ways that they interact with it, in the ways that they like, in the ways that they understand as well. Within which we face a complexity of scale and formats. And scale, I mean, for example, the newly created data sets, there are several gigabytes at least in every occasion, and the making that available longer term obviously has monetary implications as well. And how do we deal with that is an ongoing issue and ongoing question. We discussed that extensively with our departments here, especially the advanced research computing and other specialists working in this area too. And then also formats as well. As I mentioned, the TIFFs and PDFs, we specifically selected those because of their openness and the longevity, but there are new formats coming up all the time. And as most of you are probably aware, that in a 3D world, for example, as a global community, we still struggle to settle on a specific format that will be accessible and shareable and interoperable longer term, for example. The debates on that area is still ongoing. All of it is done with a strong focus on metadata and the data integrity. So metadata, as you know, the data about data, and we try to record that in a maximum detail. So from the origins of the data, origins of the material that has been digitized, if it is a digitized material, to when and the how, under which conditions these materials were digitized. And then also making sure that integrity of the data is preserved. So for example, if we create 3D models, are using drone imagery, then we make sure that the drone imagery itself is also accessible, not only the 3D models that are end result of it, because we would like to create an opportunity for future researchers to replicate those experiments if they wanted to. So reducing the dependency on the black boxes that we depend on at the time, creating more opportunities for the future. And there is a huge area within our project where we focus on public-facing data, and for that we use the ARCHIS system, Getty ARCHIS system, again, well-known system, a very powerful heritage inventory system. It comes with its own challenges as well, but at the same time, it creates a huge opportunities for creating this type of a heritage resource models where things can be interlinked, or a heritage, different elements of the heritage record can be very easily interlinked. As I said, it's a very powerful system. It allows a very interesting multilingual interface. So what you see here is, for example, the settlement in 3 languages, Russian, Chinese, and English, are 3 main languages that we operate for now, although we also work with the other languages of the independent countries there too. And so ARCHIS is interesting. ARCHIS is going to be always public-facing element of the project. But for heritage management agencies of the countries, we also create the QGIS database specifically designed for each country, specifically sometimes additional tools added into that because of the requirements of individual countries as well. And so this is how our QGIS database looks more or less now, although this data is changing every day, so the numbers will be slightly higher than here. So we have a lot of remote sensing records, about 35,000, and we have about 28,000 and maybe close to 29,000 now of a monument records. These are based on the monument passports. These are based on the monument records that the National Heritage Administration's heritage agencies hold. And we have a huge number of archive records, and those archive records can vary from being a few pages only to 300, 400 pages long notebooks, for example, recording sheets, etc., etc. And we work with about 19 partner institutions. This number is always increasing. We are open to collaboration with all research institutions in the region. And this is not only limited to institutes of archaeology, for example. We are also collaborating with all other institutions who have interest in digitizing and in contributing to heritage preservation in those countries. So we collaborate with institutions that are teaching institutions, universities, but we also, of course, collaborate with national agencies for heritage preservation as well. So within our GIS system, we basically create resources for those institutions, we create resources for actors, we create resources for archive materials and monuments, and each of them slightly different from each other, that then allow us to create all sorts of complex records. So a good example here will be Hiva or Ichan Kala. This is in Uzbekistan, in Khwarezm region, that I know very well, and I'm very much attached to this region. Lovely place, lovely people, but also some amazing monuments. This is the first World Heritage Site of Central Asia. It is an internal city that's still kind of very much of a living city. There is about, I think, if I'm not wrong, about 2,000-3,000 people, residents continuously living here. And it has multiple monuments, but within monuments, it also has additional monuments too. So what we create in our GIS package basically contains or is contained within or is related to. So relationships between the parent monuments and then the child monuments, and also linking it with different actors together as well. And as an end result of it, also giving digital copies with specific DOIs where specialists or researchers can click on that and see on those static forever open kind of data sets that we uploaded to our repositories in different places. It allows us to do multiple things. In one hand, it allows us to keep the initial database reasonably light, that can be installed on any computer, that can be opened, operated in any machine, including sometimes in handheld machines, and then the heavy data being permanently located somewhere, but linked to the database through DOI as well. So we're experimenting with these types of complexities and creating records for our colleagues in the region, but also for future researchers that will be more or less comprehensive records of those places, of those sites, of those complex monuments as well. But the Central Asia in general is a very much of a land of continuous change. There are natural changes happening. You will be well familiar with things like the Aral Sea crisis, for example, but also waterways changing all the time. And in terms of the climate crisis right now, the region is very much at the forefront. We notice that major changes in weather patterns. We notice major changes in, again, the levels of water, levels of the ice caps on top of the mountains. And sometimes these changes are very much anthropogenic, especially if we look at the later decades of the Soviet Union, the world's longest canal in Turkmenistan, or a major hydropower stations being built in Tajikistan. All of them have a huge impact on the environment there. And as a result, it also has a huge impact on archaeology and the heritage there too. And in addition there, we have also some features that are, saying, more ephemeral. So for example, if we look at the nomadic lifestyle, the stations that were used only on a seasonal basis, or if we look at the trade routes, then the way stops that were used only for a limited period of time, they're sometimes seen as ephemeral or remains of agricultural practices. But we try to record them as well, and especially the remote sensing techniques there becomes a useful tool for that. And then merging that together with the local knowledge, local community knowledge, but also primarily local specialist knowledge is really important for us. So the one good example from last year now, 2023 example, where we worked with our Kyrgyz and the Japanese colleagues in a major Silk Road site, Akbashim, and there is also the major Silk Road site called Burana, famous for its Burana Tower. The rectangle that you see in the center is the Burana site itself. It's nominated as part of the Silk Road serial nomination as a World Heritage Site as well. And what you see in this pink-violet color is basically defenses or walls around this city. Not completely, it's encircling the city, but nevertheless very important. And we can see them from Corona imagery. So this is the spy satellite black and white imagery before the major agricultural change. But we can also see those lines if we look at the Soviet period topographic maps as well. But if we look at the landscape now, those lines don't exist, because landscape, as you see here, beyond the community representatives and the specialists that we are talking to, it's a heavily agricultural region. And the Burana itself, the central part of the site with the minaret here, is well preserved and it stays there, but the landscape around it is very much, it's not considered to be, by official documents, it's not considered to be a protected area. So using the knowledge of the local colleagues and local population, working with them together and using a little bit of drone mapping techniques, we mapped specific areas where those lines were last seen, or those lines we knew that it must have some sort of a remains there. And what you see here on top of the satellite imagery is a small rectangular image that's created from drone imagery. And as you can see here, reasonably clearly, we have a very clear crop marks where those lines, those wall lines, intersect. And in a digital elevation model, we can, of course, notice them very easily. There is a clear landscape change there as well. And then creating these types of data sets and working with the Ministry of Culture allowed us to discuss this both with the landowners there, but also with the Ministry of Culture. Not necessarily they may not be able to protect all of it because of the land ownership patterns, because of the legalities of the process, but they are able to talk to the landowners now in order to ensure that they understand the significance of that place and that they understand that the too heavy intervention in those areas may actually damage something that may still be in the levels, below ground levels, well preserved. So informing them at least is a major goal there, and then beyond that we hope one day the colleagues will be able to investigate that further, maybe with our help or without our help as well. So basically, in terms of the methods and approaches, we kind of co-design those systems, and we create applications that are crucial for long-term sustainability. So being as open as possible. Yes, we are aware of the security issues. We are aware of the where necessary. We restrict zoom levels to our databases where necessary. We also omit data from being completely open access if there are vulnerabilities associated with those sites, be it looting, be it other considerations. We very much depend on our local colleagues to tell us what to make open and where to make only the metadata open, for example, not the data itself. And so the role of the institutions, partner institutions that populate the database, that add into that, is really critical. But also within that process, we also do our best to give due credit to actors or people, individuals, historical figures who are related to those historical records, who were creators of that, who were informants of those records, who contributed to those records in any way possible. And even we're considering now creating a dedicated records with a dedicated DOIs to specific individuals who played a role in creation of the large data related to Central Asian heritage. And we also focus on multilingual search and thesaurus as well, the thesaurus that is working already in multiple languages. As well known globally, different periods are often called differently in different languages, and where the dynasties start and the end is also kind of questionable sometimes, depending where we operate. So unifying those understandings under the same thesaurus so the colleagues will understand the terminology across the region is really important for us. And making searches multilingual. So for example, if someone puts a specific term in Chinese, even if the record is not in Chinese but in Russian, the system will be able still to show that record. So the colleagues then using the modern tools now with computer translation or AI-based translations, they can access those data sets and benefit from that as well. So so-called elastic search, we're implementing it both in Archie system but also in QGIS-based databases as well, which is very useful for colleagues. And then despite all of this, I don't want to paint this picture where everything is very rosy. Actually establishing truly open and a collaborative system with a long lifespan still remains a challenge, despite all the talk that we have with colleagues and despite all the talk globally in this area, partly because of the differing levels of the readiness to this, and also mainly because of the technology moving ahead without mindset of different institutions and institutional mindset, if that's a real thing, not yet quite being there. And we are working very hard with colleagues in order to explain how this will work out in the longer term. And when they see the benefits of it, it's a lot easier for us now in a 5 years after the start of the project to argue these points, because they see the immediate benefits of that as well. And then in terms of the wider picture, very few databases of this nature go far enough to inform decisions of wide group of stakeholders. And in our case, participatory data gathering is now enabling participatory management planning as well, even in this difficult region, by showing that everyone has a voice, not only voice, but also ability to contribute to that decision making. We are achieving something that's longer term, we hope will be very useful. Our local partners very much identify the data-driven management strategies as something that's a priority for them. So when they make a decision in terms of restricting certain developments or in terms of allowing or not allowing a certain expansion, or be it agriculture, be it a power plant, be it any other type of economic activity, they would like very much to argue those points using data-driven arguments, and that we are able to help with that, at least in a whatever limited capacity we may be able to help with that. And then also they're very keen in terms of the data-driven risk assessment, and we are very keen on that too. So we are doing a lot of analytical work, computational work that helps us to predict certain risks in certain areas. And capacity building is, of course, we are committed to that, but also our local partners very much committed to that as well. And they see this as a hugely beneficial thing for themselves as well. So now, in terms of my own questions now, what do I question myself very often? This is fully adequate, so it is very useful and long thought through as well. So we spend a lot of time in the past discussing the approaches, and we spend it maybe every month with colleagues as well, reassessing our achievements and reassessing our failures as well. But can we do more though? I think one of the more of a philosophical arguments is that, are we still broadly functioning within the state-based heritage model? So by starting from heritage documentation such as passports, and also primarily focusing on the digitizing the research institutions, academics-driven data, are we basically functioning within the state system again? Are we really interacting with different levels of the stakeholders? We are trying to, but is it enough? And then also, are we doing enough to incorporate different models of landscape perception and cultural practices? So, for example, major pilgrimage sites in the region, they are not always structures with prominent religious architecture. They are sometimes places of the outstanding natural beauty. They are sometimes the specific points in the landscape that are not registered as by the state or by the heritage institutions as monuments. But nevertheless, their importance for different practices, including some intangible heritage practices, is really significant. So this is one of the areas where I am having a lot of conversations with our colleagues in order to create some sort of a opportunity for recording those things as well. Yes, we are working with ephemeral remains of the past, but how about this living heritage, as it were, places as well? And then also, by innovating in digital methods, the project is also opening the ways of experiencing heritage for different interest groups, and then allowing them to produce new narratives for old sites. So, for example, virtual reality is a good thing, or the 3D recording and then making that available so people can interact with it using their mobile devices is a good example of that. But how about the traditional narrative? So allowing to create new narratives is really important, but also there are multiple voices from the different groups in the region that have their own interpretations for those sites, which are enormously valuable, of course, from the point of view, to take the critical cultural heritage point of view. These are really valuable for us to record and to interact with. But what are the ways of doing that for us in a best possible manner is still something that we have to crack that code, as it were. It's a very challenging in a region which is huge in geography, but also huge in diversity in terms of languages, dialects, cultures, and religions as well. So I end this part of my presentation with more of a questions than the answers. And now maybe I'll spend a couple of minutes to mention the careers. Especially when we come to digital and looking at where our recent graduates ended up in the last 10 years of my working at UCL, for example, what I realized is that digital fundamentals are really important. So the basics of digital technology, rather than just knowing that technology exists. So, for example, instead of just knowing that how to fly drones, that the drones can do something, actually understanding how the photography works in the first place, how the landscape documentation works in the first place in a digital world, knowing the digital fundamentals of that nature. And then also focusing on competencies over specifics. So I think I may be wrong, maybe different organizations have different requirements for recent graduates. But actually, in my experience, if people show digital competencies over software-specific knowledge, that's more valuable for me, because software-specific knowledge it's ever-changing, and different organizations may actually implement different software for doing exactly the same things, be it geographical information systems to management of the archive files in I don't know, in a photographic catalog even. So creating digital competencies, knowing, so for example, what formats to use, knowing what the pixels are as opposed to the vector data, for example, knowing how the GIS system operates in a different environments, knowing basics of the projection and coordinate systems. Those things are the competencies that are more valuable, in my experience, to recent graduates, and then they can learn software-specific knowledge if there need to be. And then adapting to change in this ever-evolving technological environment, investing time to understand the basics of all of that is crucial as well. So if we are talking about the AI now, actually understanding what does this mean, what this AI and the predictive text and the things like the ChatGPT, what they're working on, what's the basics of that, is really crucial in my view as well. And informal learning, so the importance of going beyond formal education is really crucial. So to embrace self-directed learning, there is a lot of materials, especially for digital area, especially in the heritage world. People are very open to share the knowledge with other colleagues. So benefiting from that, learning whatever is accessible online, or attending seminars or attending the open sessions like this one, in order to learn from them and building up the kind of a capacity and the competence levels that are necessary for variety of jobs. In general, the job market in the last 12 months in particular is very challenging globally. Talking to my recent graduates, I realized that, and be it India, be it China, be it other parts of the world, it seems to be the same almost everywhere. In a post-pandemic world, the countries, the status quo is kind of destroyed now, so that different organizations are approaching their duties in terms of heritage management and heritage record keeping in a very different ways. And the heritage in general depends on a state funding extensively, as we all know, and the states are not in the place now to keep up those fundings in most of the world. So the reality is that it's a very challenging world, and also it's very common now for specialists to switch jobs. So standing in one organization for a lifetime probably is a remnant of the past. So having those competencies, being ready for diverse areas of work market or job market, and being able to address different challenges of different organizations, I think, in my view, will be really important going forward. And digital may be one of those fundamental pillars of that, where specialists, recent graduates, can make themselves readily available for different challenges going forward. So I'll stop here. Thanks so much, and I'll be happy to answer any questions or listen to any suggestions. Thank you.